Cool. Just let me know when I should start talking.
Cool. Right. Right, yeah. Okay, I don't know, more people probably filter in a couple minutes. Just start now.
Okay.
But start from where we were before, I think, unless you want to start from the beginning.
No, I'll just give a 2-minute summary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Ready?
Yeah.
Hey everyone, welcome to Introduction to Blockchain from a Cybersecurity Perspective, Part 2. It's really funny that when we were talking about the way this fancy new decentralized internet works, my internet happened to die. But anyway, this session is sponsored by Glizzycoin, and they were so generous they gave me a graphic image of what a Glizzycoin looks like. So thank you, whoever did that. All right. I know that we stopped at Byzantine generals problem, but I'll just give a 2-minute summary of everything we covered there. Essentially, a blockchain should actually be thought about as a distributed ledger technology, which is a group of computers who don't trust each other, need to come into an agreement about certain things without the involvement of any central parties or middlemen. And we will discuss how do you build such a system. And we realize that blockchain is nothing but such a distributed ledger, just that the data is stored in a chain of blocks where using hashing techniques and stuff that we'll talk about later, a block would basically have the hash of the previous block, a timestamp of when the block was actually created, a nonce, which we'll talk about later in detail, and a transaction root. The transaction root itself comes from a data structure called Merkle tree, which to me personally is the sexiest data structure in the world today. Essentially, you take all the transactions, you hash them, and then you start hashing them in pairs until you get the root of a tree. And the reason you do that is so that authentication on a blockchain is really, really quick. You go from ON, linear time complexity, to a logarithmic time complexity. So in this case, even though you have 16 transactions, to authenticate if a transaction is there, I only need 4 other transactions because there are 4 levels to my trees, because 2 to the power 4 is 16. And then we started discussing questions on how do you build such a data structure. The problem is, well, how do you make sure that when a new block is created, you make sure that all the nodes in the blockchain can hear about this. You ask how can they verify about this. You ask about how they can add it to their own blockchain. And finally, you ask how do you prevent tampering of blocks? Because in this case, all I need to do to successfully tamper with this 3-block blockchain is to simply change the hash of the last block and we are done. But we need to build a system such that this is not possible. And we realized that actually in like the last 12 years of history of blockchain, no one has actually been able to do this in a really wide scale. And we wanted to discuss from a cybersecurity perspective, why is such a thing possible? And that's just a list of questions that we'll talk about and hopefully understand the answers to each of them. And to help us answer some of these questions, I introduced something known as the Byzantine generals problem. In this case, very briefly, you have 2 generals. Even though the picture says 3, just ignore the third one for now. Let's say you have 2 generals. They're on either side of a certain island or a certain land that they both need to conquer. These 2 generals are coward in that they will only attack if they know for sure that the other general will attack. And the reason that is the case is because the only way they can capture this land is if both of the generals attack at the same time. And well, I'm not sure if this part of the recording was in the stream last time, so I'll just go over this properly again. Let's talk about how you would build such a system. How would these 2 generals in the prehistoric era, in an era without the internet, how would they come to an agreement of when to sort of attack? So let's say General 1 sends a message with a pigeon to General 2 saying, hey, let's attack at 1 p.m. Now, let's assume that even though the pigeon flies over the enemy camp, the pigeon never gets caught or Worse, the enemy camp captures the pigeon and sends a wrong message to General 2. Let's assume that none of this happens, right? So this is the best possible case we can be in. So General 1 sends this sort of sends the pigeon with this message to General 2. General 2 gets the message, but General 1 doesn't know that 2 got the message. So they would still not attack. So now General 2 would send them an acknowledgement. Hey, General 1, I actually did hear your message. Okay, let's attack at 1 a.m. or 1 p.m. So General 1 now gets the message that General 2 knows to attack at 1 p.m. But now General 2 wouldn't attack because General 2 is not sure that 1 got the acknowledgement. So to stop that, perhaps General 1 will send an acknowledgement of the acknowledgement. So I know that you act that we should attack at 1 p.m. And so General 2 gets this now, but again, General 1 will still not attack because it's not sure that 2 knows that 1 knows that 2 knows that they both should attack at 1 p.m. And this can go on until infinity. And so we have 70 years worth of math proofs that basically say that the two Byzantine general problem is effectively unsolvable. But if you scale that up to like 3 generals or n generals, then it actually could be possible to solve it. In fact, according to the math, we say that these n generals can come to an agreement as long as no 2/3 of, as long as no 1/3 of the generals are dishonest. So it is quite possible. By dishonest, I mean it's quite possible that the general themselves is actually working for the enemy, or that the messages are lost quite often or corrupted in a way. And this is known as Byzantine fault tolerance. And this is actually a really, really important concept in distributed systems in general, not just in blockchain, but in every distributed system in the world. So for example, all Boeing flights or all Airbus flights have this concept of Byzantine fault tolerance baked into the system. Because if you think about it, a flight is just a collection of several sensors who have to talk to each other and come in consensus with something without the involvement of a master sensor per se. And the flights will continue to operate as long as at least 2/3 of the sensors are working properly or are functioning properly. In fact, it's such an important problem that even SpaceX has a proper, I think, Reddit post about this, about how they're considering about Byzantine fault tolerance. Now, the last point in this slide is particularly interesting. If you do not have Byzantine fault tolerance, then what happens? Well, then you can alter transactions, you can reverse transactions, and this is really, really bad. But to make things worse, there is no central party that will help you come back and fix all the mess that is created. You're always going to be just a distributed set of computers with no particular leader. And once there is mayhem there, the mayhem will only escalate. So that's why Byzantine fault tolerance is exceptionally important. And we talked about, and then, so let's talk about how you actually achieve Byzantine fault tolerance. And the way to achieve it, I love it. It's called the gossip protocol. And it is as simple as the gossip that we humans do. If you think about how we gossip, essentially, I know something, a juicy news, and I'll tell my friend, and they will tell their friend, and that's how people broadcast messages to each other. And this is what gossip protocol is. Essentially, if I hear that there's a new block in my blockchain, I will tell all the nodes I'm connected to, and I know that they will tell all the nodes they are connected to, and so on. So I'll just pass, it's message passing or information passing. And as we talked about earlier, this will only work as long as there are less than 1/3 traitors in the system. So in the second image, sorry, I used Microsoft Paint to draw this because I couldn't get a decent image anywhere. In this case, you have sort of the red is the traitor, and you have 3 good generals, and they all are trying to attack this house. Luckily for us, less than 1/3 is a traitor, so all the generals can come to an agreement that they need to attack at a certain time. But more importantly, they also know who is the traitor and who to not listen to, right? But in the image on the left, you have actually 4 out of the 8 nodes that are traitors, and you'll see that the blue nodes will actually end up listening to the red nodes, the traitor nodes. And if you take a step back away from computer science and think about fake news or rumors, this is why rumors or fake news are so easy to spread, because you only need less than one third. You only need one third of the people around you to believe in the rumor or to spread it across, and everyone will hear about this. And this is why squashing something like a rumor is so hard. Um, and so now, if you take a step back, so we have Gossip Protocol. Gossip Protocol implements Byzantine fault tolerance, and that means great. Now we have a distributed system which can coexist with malicious actors so long as there are no more than 34% greater than one third. So as long as there are no more than 34% attackers or malicious actors rather. And also because of Gossip Protocol, I can be sure that if there's a new block on the blockchain, all of the nodes in the network will hear about this, because that's the concept of blockchain. So that's great. But this still doesn't answer some of the other questions, particularly, well, how do you still prevent fake transactions, or even how do you still prevent someone from coming in and flooding the network with a lot of transactions or causing a DDoS, a distributed denial of service attack? And also, we still didn't talk about like how do you verify some of these blocks on the chain and stuff. And so we go on to what Satoshi Nakamoto did in 2008 in his seminal paper about Bitcoin. The genius of Satoshi Nakamoto was what we call the Nakamoto consensus, also colloquially known as the proof of work algorithm. The idea for this comes from back in like the 90s, late 90s. So emails were becoming a big thing. And more importantly, the general population was getting into emails. Now, if you have a bunch of people who aren't educated much in the IT sector, what happens is that you get a lot of scam that takes place. So a lot of people started sending junk email or spam email, like, hey, I'm a Nigerian prince, can you give me like $1,000 or whatever? Actually, more amounts probably. And then the way some of these scientists thought about preventing some of these spam was, what if you would have to pay every time you would send an email? Now, this is an interesting concept, right? If I have to pay every time I send an email, I will think much harder about sending the email. In fact, I would probably stop spamming you because I'll have to pay. It's no more free money for me. And that was the concept of Hashcash. And you can imagine why this never took off in the email system. No one wants to pay for emails. But you can take that, tweak that a bit, and use that in the blockchain system. So what if instead of actually paying, you would have to do a lot of hard work to make sure a transaction gets added to the chain? And when I say hard work, what I mean is hard work for the computers, for the nodes. So what Satoshi Nakamoto said was, what if to validate any transaction, you need to get the computers to solve a very, very hard mathematical problem, something like decrypting hashes. Now remember, hashes work on the principle of one way. So given an input, it's very, very easy for me to find the output, but given the output, I can never find the input. Sorry, never is the wrong word. What I mean to say is it's really, really hard for me to find the input. I probably will have to brute force. So like I'll have to go by every possible sentence in the whole world to figure out which one hashes to this. That's a very, very hard, that's a very CPU intensive process. And so Nakamoto said, well, what if to verify any transaction, you have to get them to do this very hard work? They realized that the result that when you would brute force and eventually solve this math problem, it'll always be a 32-bit nonce, and that's the nonce that gets added to the block, right? Now these problems, just like hashing, very, very hard to solve, very, very easy to check if someone did the right answer. So as soon as a miner, so miners are the people who actually do this, who actually verify if a transaction is valid and add it to the block. So as soon as a miner cracks this very hard mathematical problem, They broadcast it to the network. Again, think back to Gossip Protocol. They broadcast it to the network, and then everyone verifies if indeed this miner was did solve the problem, but more importantly, was this the miner the first one to solve the problem? Now you may ask, why would a miner spend so much money and time in solving these mathematical problems? What is their gain? Their gain is actually that in this system, in proof of work, which is used in Bitcoin, they will get a Bitcoin as a reward for validating some of these transactions. So now the miners are also really pretty happy, right? Like they do a lot of work and in return, they get a pretty good reward. Over time, obviously, as Bitcoin becomes more and more famous, the rewards reduce because there are more and more Bitcoin in the supply. So you now get like a fraction of Bitcoin, not a whole Bitcoin. And so that's how you sort of prevent a lot of DDoS attacks, because now I can't just, okay, yeah, sorry. And to prevent DDoS attacks, so to prevent me from actually spamming the network, I will pay a transaction fee for doing this transaction. So now I, as a spammer, am not incentivized to spend a lot of Bitcoin to have a lot of junk transactions. So I'm not going to do a DDoS attack, or distributed denial of service attack. The miners are also really happy in verifying the transactions and broadcasting it to the network. And obviously, because they get a Bitcoin, they are incentivized to make sure that the blockchain is always remains intact. So if you think about it, no miner would now want to take over or attack the network, because as soon as they would attack the network, news would spread out and people would start believing in the security of Bitcoin blockchain. And then the value of Bitcoin itself would drop. And so all of a sudden, all of their rewards would become negligible. So now they are also incentivized to not attack. And that's the beauty of the system. I am a big fan of game theory, and sort of this is like the optimal game theory situation where everyone sort of wins. So now we sort of answered a lot of these questions. We figured out how everyone hears about a new block. We figured out how to verify it, how to make sure everyone agrees to a consensus, comes to a consensus. We figured out how to sort of disincentivize people to not do a distributed attack. And also, so we still have two questions. How do you prevent tampering and how do you prevent fake transactions? In a way, again, proof of work does some of these, but I'll talk about that in the next slide with a nice infographic. So if you go back to some slides back, yeah, here, in this case, now, so in this case, what an attacker is doing is they're changing a particular transaction on block 2. By changing a transaction block 2, they actually change the Merkle tree hash, the Merkle tree root of block 2. And as a result, now block 2 has a new hash, right? And the only way they can get away by tampering with this blockchain is by changing the previous hash in block 3. But we know to mine a block is a lot of hard work. So it's not that easy to now change the previous hash, because changing the previous hash would change the hash of this block. And everyone just sort of verified that 3 was the original block, right? But to take that problem a step further, let's look at this infographic, right? Let's assume we're on block 91 of the Bitcoin blockchain, right? I am an attacker and I want to alter a transaction on 74 just because I want to do something like a double spend. So for example, I had spent 10 Bitcoins and I'd given it to a friend of mine, but I don't like the fact that I actually had to spend some money. So I'll now try to take back my money and see if I can get away with it. So I figure out that my transaction now is in block 74. So I change the transaction block 74 saying, okay, let's remove this transaction or let's make it something else. This changes the hash of block 74, but this also kind of breaks the blockchain, because now 75 points to a block that doesn't really exist, and 76 points to block 75, which itself points to a block that doesn't really exist, and so on. So now, if I want people to accept that the real blockchain is the one without this transaction, in 74, I'll effectively have to redo the computation for all the blocks from 74 to 90, because everyone knows we're already in block 91. So I need to make it look like 74 to 90 is valid, like this new 74 to 90 chain is equally valid. So I'm going to go through do all of that brute force work 18 times, because there are 18 blocks. And not just that, I'll have to finish the computation of all of these 18 blocks before some miner finishes the computation of block 91. And this is why tampering on the blockchain is so difficult if you're trying to change a transaction that is way before, like in this case, like 18 blocks behind the actual chain. And if you actually work in the blockchain industry, especially in the Bitcoin industry, they will tell a lot about waiting. They'll use the term that a transaction is confirmed if there are 6 more blocks in front of it. Because if an attacker would ever want to change that transaction now, they'll have to do expensive computation for those 6 blocks. And given the difficulty currently of mining, that is probabilistically impossible, or rather improbable, right? That is why they say wait for 6 blocks of confirmation. If it's just 1 block, it's easier. But again, as I said, no miner would do that, because everyone would know that Bitcoin was a facade and its value would just drop instantly, and all of their money has just become negligible, right? So that was how you prevent any sort of attacks on the blockchain in terms of an incentivization principle. But let's talk about proof of work. Proof of work gets a lot of bad reputation in the world because of the electricity usage that it creates. And that's for good reasons, right? But then you have to ask yourself, well, why is proof of work used then by Bitcoin? Why do we use such a computationally expensive system? And more importantly, why is it so hard to mine a blockchain? Well, so we spoke about this. The reason proof of work was created because it's really, really secure. Effectively, mining a block is a really hard process, because if it was really easy, anyone could do it. And more importantly, anyone could reverse or alter transactions in previous blocks, right? In this situation, let's say you managed to pull it off. You managed to do 18 blocks of expensive computation before block 91 was ever done. Now the community has 2 choices here. They can either choose, or 2 forks rather. They can either continue to go on the original blockchain, the one where the transaction on 74 exists, or they can choose this new block, this new blockchain where a transaction on 74 never exists. And the entire community has to vote in real time about which chain they want to stay on, right? And if changing blocks becomes very easy, then the entire community would waste too much time always voting on what chain to follow or what fork to follow. And then you actually have screwed up the entire blockchain, because now no one's actually spending time verifying and adding transactions to the block. Everyone's just spending time voting on what chain they prefer. And that's what forking is, having 2 multiple chains going on in parallel. It's like, you could think about that as parallel universes, effectively. But you get to decide which universe you want to be on. And the entire community has to decide on their own. And so it's like, in a way, if you think about it, you do all of this work. It's like you have an engine in a car, and the sole purpose of the engine is to slow the car down, right? Because here you're doing so much work just to make sure that everything's really, really hard, to make sure that there's no forking. But then you don't ever use the output of the work done. Like you get a nonce, great, but at the end, the nonce is just a wastage. All of that CPU power is just wasted, right? More importantly, because this is so computationally expensive, you'll see that all the big mining companies are always in the same countries where electricity is cheap. And who controls electricity? Governments. So you created such a crazy distributed system, so decentralized, but at the end, it still is geographically sort of consolidated into certain regions, and it's still under the control of governments because they control electricity. In a way, this is a school of thought. But anyway, I digress from my original talk, which is about security, like a cybersecurity perspective of blockchain. So we spoke about forking a bit, and I just wanted to show a picture about what fork looks like. So you have the original chain here, and you have a forked chain, which is a slightly different representation of the world. And by the way, forking is a real thing. Forks happen all the time. There are at least 60 different forks of Bitcoin. One is called Bitcoin Gold, one is called Bitcoin Cash. That's a new one. I think Bitcoin Cash recently forked into two parts as well. Ethereum has a very big fork. It was Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. But forks are also sometimes not that bad. Sometimes fork is thought about as this way of altering transactions. But forks can also happen when you want to do a network upgrade. You want to say some of the core devs of a blockchain decide to add certain new features to the chain, like reduce gas fees or increase the block size, right? Like in this case, in the bottom, you have an increased block size. So now you have two chains, right? One is with the original block size and one with the new double block size. And then the people decide which chain they want to go on, sort of thing. And this is a real situation. There has been Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash are two forks because the people in Bitcoin Cash community wanted to increase the block size, whereas the people in the original Bitcoin community didn't want to do that. And so sometimes forking is actually really, really good as well. Another analogy to think about forking is, imagine if every time Facebook would get a messenger upgrade or Snapchat would get a messenger upgrade, the community, gets to decide which version you can stay on. Obviously, in the world of centralized servers, such a thing is not possible. You're forced to update and stick with them. In fact, there's a very funny story. The idea of forking comes from Vitalik Buterin, who actually it doesn't come from him, but there's a very interesting story. Vitalik Buterin, who created Ethereum, said that he got into the blockchain space because he was a big fan of League of Legends, I think. And once upon a time, like League of Legends got a major update, and he didn't like it. And he thought, what if you could live in such a system where the community can decide what upgrades you want and stuff. And that's how this whole principle of decentralization comes about. So now we're going on the more interesting slides about attacks. So we spoke about distributed denial service of attacks. Let's talk about the 51% attack. Effectively, you have miners who kind of are the main part of the network in that they verify all the transactions. What if there were 51% of the miners would start colluding with each other? So if they would always collude with each other, because they're 51%, greater than the majority, they can swing the entire network into any direction they see fit, right? So they can prevent, because they can just create a new chain with certain transactions or without certain transactions. In fact, they can reverse transactions. They can do what is known as double spend. Double spend is, because this is digital money and not real money, you can, like how you copy paste URLs or images, you can copy a Bitcoin and send it to another. And this is what proof of work tried to do, like not allow something like double spend. But in a 51% attack, you could do it because, say, for example, you have Alice and Bob, and Alice sends coins to Bob. Now, Alice is actually malicious in that she is involved in a 51% attack. So now she could create a chain. So let's say just before this fork, Alice has sent 10 coins to Bob, right? Now she is doing a 51% attack. And in this new chain that she and some of her peers are building, she reverses the transaction from Alice to Bob. And so now everyone believes that the longest chain, the best chain, is one where Alice once again has those 10 coins and she can spend it on something else. So in fact, she didn't really spend any money at all, and Bob loses out here, right? Um, but once again, so that's how you can do a double spend. Now, 51% attack is again, the principle is, in if your consensus algorithm is proof of work, to do a 51% attack, you need to have 51% of the network's resources. So that's 51% of the entire GPU power of the network, which is pretty hard. And the more different miners you have, the harder it gets, because that's more power that you need to make sure is under you. And that's why minor pools or minor teams are actually looked down upon, because then they can have a lot of sort of control over the network. But again, as I said before, this is not actually a profitable option for them, because even if Alice would succeed to do an attack, everyone would know that there was an attack on the blockchain, and then no one would use it. So obviously the value of the cryptocurrency would drop. And now she has 10 extra coins, great. But then firstly, no one's using the coins. And secondly, those coins have no value. So, that's how that is another disincentivization mechanism to not do sort of an attack. There are other consensus algorithms, such as proof of stake, the one that Ethereum's transitioning to now. We won't talk about that. Even there, you can do a 51% attack. Basically, you need to have a control of 51% of the stake. That's what's called proof of stake. Prove me that you staked. In proof of work, I prove you that I worked. I did that hashing thing. Here, I prove you that I staked. So this is how you disincentivize people to not do these kinds of attacks. So that's 51% attack. That's very common. Everyone talks about this. Everyone's scared about this. But obviously, there's another attack. Remember, I said all blockchains are Byzantine fault tolerant. They use the gossip protocol, which means that if there are 34% of the traitors in the network, you can kind of control them. And that is known as the 34% attack. For whatever reason, this isn't talked about in the industry as much as 51% attack is. I think that's because 51 is just a nice number in that everyone knows 51 is majority. 34 is just a weird, obscure number. Why would 1/3 have anything to do with it? And also, to do a 34% attack, it's pretty hard. You have to have firewalls and all kinds of fancy things, right? And in fact, I think later on I will do a very brief talk about how to do a 34% attack if time permits. And I'd definitely like to. I wrote down a proper text document on how to do it, because it's a bit messed up. You essentially sort of divide the room in 3 parts, and you have to do a firewall between one of them and stuff. But it's a bit interesting. We'll talk about that later at the end, and I'm about to finish anyway. So yeah, that is how those are all the concepts of the underlying infrastructure of a blockchain. That's how easy it is to understand blockchain effectively, or to design a blockchain effectively. So just to recap, essentially, blockchain is nothing but a distributed ledger technology, distributed computers with no sort of central authority on top of them, no middlemen, try to come in consensus without trusting each other. We talked that a distributed ledger must be immutable and highly secure. The way we guarantee this is by consensus algorithms like proof of work that make it really, really hard to attack the blockchain, tamper with it, reverse transactions, double spend transactions, and so on. You typically have a cryptocurrency layer on top of blockchain, because the cryptocurrency acts like the money that sort of incentivizes or disincentivizes people from doing things. Obviously, attacks are possible. All kinds of attacks are there, but they are unlikely thanks to the disincentivization mechanism. Thanks to immutability, blockchains are known as the best place to authenticate and maintain transparency and even conduct auditing, because once something is in a blockchain, you assume, and it has 6 blocks of transaction, you assume that you cannot change it, right? Not all blockchains are similar. as I said, and not they have different consensus algorithms. Not all DLTs are blockchains. You could have DLTs that store data differently, and they have different properties. And I mean that's a talk for on its own. Like each DLT, I work for a DLT called Hedera Hash Graph. That itself will take like a whole hour or two to explain, and that has its own idiosyncrasies and stuff. Challenges. So there is one really interesting axiom, I guess, within the blockchain space, created by Vitalik Buterin, creator of Ethereum, wherein this is not formally proved, but it's basically said that you cannot have all three of decentralization, scaling, and security. You can choose between any two of these. So you could either have a really decentralized and a really secure system, but it would be slow, like Bitcoin, or you could have a trade-off where you let go of some decentralization and have scaling, and this is what Ethereum is moving as it does proof of stake now. So there is more control. The control is going to lesser people, but it's still fairly decentralized because of the way Ethereum works and the number of different people in the community of Ethereum. But you cannot have all three of them, and that's sort of the holy trifecta problem in blockchain. Before I move on to like sort of the CTF that Harlan has prepared for you and 34% attack, in case anyone's interested, obviously this is just like an introduction to blockchain. There are tons of other things. A lot of the attacks on blockchain actually don't happen on the network layer. It's very secure. Most of the attacks happen on what's known as smart contracts. Smart contracts are a network layer on top of the blockchain network. And here it's programmable. So the problem with Bitcoin is it's great, but only thing you can do is send and receive Bitcoins. But because blockchains are so immutable, you can do all kinds of crazy things. I could put in the deed of my real estate place and we could trade real estate together, or we could crowdsource, or we could do any kinds of fun stuff, right? And the way you do that is by writing your own custom code on the blockchain, leveraging its consensus protocol, and that you do by smart contracts. You essentially write contracts like lawyers do, and do stuff. And most of the attacks that happen on blockchain happens on smart contracts. And there are tons of this. People have lost the very first big attack. People have lost more than $1 billion worth of coins because of smart contract problems. And again, there is, unlike normal software engineering, smart contracts are immutable. Once you write the code, you can never change it. And we all know you can never write a bug-free code. And that's why it's more easy to exploit smart contracts. You also have permissioned blockchains. So these are private blockchains. Instead of making the blockchain public to everyone and anyone can join, only certain specific people can join. So think about like a blockchain between just banks and no one else, right? You have decentralized storage, which is the idea of, again, storing data on a decentralized platform. You have zero knowledge proofs. That's a cryptographic concept that, again, is a talk of its own. Essentially, how can I prove you something without giving you much information about it? So if I send 10 coins to Bob or to Alice, I want to make sure that everyone knows that the transaction is valid, but I don't want anyone to know that I sent coins to Bob, and I don't want anyone to know that I sent 10 coins to Bob. So I want to prove you that the transaction is valid without giving any information about me. And that's the privacy aspect for blockchain. Because, well, if a blockchain is public, everyone can see the data. So it's not really private anymore. And zero knowledge proofs help to do that. And there are a ton of other philosophies that are involved in the space of decentralization. That was the main part of the talk, about introducing what a blockchain is technically, talking about how to make such a thing and why it is secure, or how to make a blockchain secure. Feel free to contact me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm actually on the CyberSec Discord. You can message me there. And of course, if you have any Glizzycoins and you like my talk, send them to that address. I need to get the hot dog, which is in Harlan's refrigerator. And yeah, that's it. I did say this is not a business talk, but in case someone is actually really curious about how to use blockchain in the normal industry, I have an infographic. I am happy to share this slide to this presentation to the community, so like you guys can go through with this in your own time. And that's sort of the end of it. Now, before I continue, I would ask Harlan if there are any questions, and if people are interested to know how to do a 34% attack and all of that stuff. So Harlan, are there any questions?
I don't seem to see it. Sorry, apparently I'm quite loud. I don't see any questions in the chat. So I think we're fine there. Personally, I'm fine listening to a 34% attack. Would like to just quickly plug that after this, we're going to be heading over to our Discord for the CTF. So make sure that after the talk, you come over there and don't just leave. Yeah, I'll hand back to you if people want to listen about a 34% attack.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Before that, well, I will be there during the CTF. So if you guys have any questions while doing the CTF about blockchains, or just want to talk to me about blockchains, feel free to like ask me about them. The CTF is very interesting because we spoke about these two attacks somewhere, the 51% and the 34% attack. And the CTF, if I remember correctly, helps you do a 51% attack on a private Ethereum blockchain that Harlan set up for everyone.
Yep.
And that it's very interesting to do something like that in practical, because you'll actually understand about blocks and chains and security and all of that stuff later on. All right, so I'm going to end this stream for now and then just show my face and talk about a 34% attack because I don't actually have any sort of slides for this. Bear with me for a moment. Ooh, sorry. While I do that, yes, please. All right, so actually, all right, I'm not sure what's happening here. But okay, so we're going to do a 34% attack. Now, 34% basically means I'm going to divide the entire room in 3 parts. So imagine you're in a lecture hall, you all are listening to me, and I'm going to divide you in 3 sections. So you have Section A, Section B, and Section C. And assume the people in Section B, so right in front of me in the middle, they're the bad people. They're malicious, right? And these are the 34% that are actually bad. The other 2 sections, to my left and to my right, they are good people. Now imagine I have a firewall this side, right? So Section A, effectively, these people can only talk to the rest of the world through that firewall. Now again, I am also one of the malicious people, and that's how I make the 34%, because you all divide in 3 parts, so you're 33, I'm the 1% extra, effectively. So I'm malicious, and my job is to try and break the blockchain, right? So effectively, I'm going to shut down all the traffic between Section A here, with the other 2 spots of the room, right? Now, obviously, you guys are in cybersecurity, you would say, well, what if Section 1 here has a partition detector? Well, if the partition detector does exist, then the hackers kind of already won, because Section 1 can just talk to each other and they can keep trying to add blocks to their blockchain, but they can't talk to the 2/3 of us. And also, more importantly, because just 1/3 of them, they will only operate with 1/3 of the GPU power that we 2/3 have. So there is no way they can ever create a blockchain that's more longer than the blockchain that I'm controlling with Section 3 or Section C here. I kind of forgot if I did A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3. So just bear with me as I use both of them at the same time. Now, so in this case, even if you have a partition detector, clearly I could still get away with creating a blockchain of my own and doing all kinds of funny things that I want to do on my blockchain. I can, in fact, also double spend here. So because I'm the malicious side and I created the firewall, I can talk to both sides of you, right? Section 1 and Section 3. So I can just spend my money on one side, wait for 6 blocks of confirmation, then I can go to the other section, do the same, wait for 6 blocks of confirmation, obviously these both have their own forks, and so at the same time I've spent like one coin on two pots, and I've only actually spent one coin in general, right? And that's how I have successfully cheated. So sorry, this was the case when there is no partition detector. My bad. If there was, so obviously because there is no partition detector, there is the section one has no idea that there's a firewall in between. Sorry, it's very intensive for me as well, doing a 34% attack. So I messed up. Apologies for that. So you have no partition detector. Hacker section one has no idea, and that's why they would continue mining their blocks. We will continue mining our blocks, and I can spend money on both sides and get away with double spending, right? Let's go to case two when there is a partition detector, right? In that case, well, it's almost like 1/3 of the world has gone silent mysteriously, right? In that case, the malicious group, so section 2 here, we would also purposely go silent mysteriously. Now 2/3 of the blockchain network have effectively gone silent. And now the whole chain kind of freezes because 67% of the network is not doing anything. 1/3 of the network could be mining blocks, but they don't sort of have a majority, so they can't really continue here, right? And then section 1 has a firewall around them, so they don't know that there's section 3 here that's actually also trying to work with it. And again, this is assuming that the malicious people, have created a really, really good firewall. And you can see how that's pretty impossible. And that's why 34% attacks happen very, very rarely, right? Section 1, for section 1, section 2 sort of sends messages to themselves, and their messages never come out. Section 1 hears messages only from their own side, and they can't hear anything else. And section 3, there also hears messages and can't send it out to anyone. So again, I can again be malicious and start spending my coins on both sides and get away with it. So regardless of how I would build a partition detector, I can always get away by doing a double spend transaction, as long as the malicious people, are greater than 1/3, right? And obviously that's really, really hard to do, building a firewall that no one can crack through. And that's why no one has been able, at least to my knowledge, no one has been able to conduct a successful 34% attack on a public blockchain per se. There is a beautiful talk by scientists who have actually created Hedera Hashgraph, which was the DLT I mentioned earlier, who goes in detail about how to do a 34% attack. I will share the links with the slides later on. I really recommend watching it because he obviously has, because he is a distributed computer scientist. That makes no sense. He actually has a lot of research on this subject, so he can explain it in a much better way than I have. But yeah, that's the end of how to do a 34% attack. If you didn't understand it, feel free to ask me. But I hope you kind of got an idea of how to do it. But yeah, that's the end of it. I hope you liked blockchains as much as I do. I hope it intrigues you as much as it intrigues me. But yeah, thank you so much, Harlan.
Great. I'll put those links in the description once I've got them. But I think since that's everything, we'll head over to Discord now.
Cool. I'll
and
stop
have
the
a go with
stream.
CTF.
Yeah.
Yep, I'll stop.